Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, from me, Guy Monson, to our regular 6-minute strategy summary. As the leadership candidates for the prime-ministership of the UK line up over the next few days and make their pitches, we thought it might be useful to take a break from market data and look instead at what might lie in the in-tray of the new Prime Minister as they step over the threshold of number 10 in a few weeks' time. We'll look first at the twin deficits, both trade and budget, then at labour markets, the consumer, trade and finally defence. We'll wrap up by considering for a moment also what a good Brexit might look like by comparing the UK's performance to some of the most successful sovereign nations that our new Prime Minister might seek to emulate. So let's begin to look at that inbox in a little bit more detail. One of the first items I think the new Prime Minister is going to have to deal with is the state of the currency and the state of the budget deficit and the current account. Looking at the currency first in the left-hand panel, you can see that US dollar sterling rate falling by about 12.5% for the year to date, a big drop. But look at the euro sterling rate in blue, almost flat for the year. In other words, the problem is more one of dollar strength than of sterling weakness. Indeed, the sterling trade weighted index is only off 3%. On the right-hand side in the top panel, I've shown the budget balance, the public sector net borrowing requirement, that's the old PSBR, still minus 6%, a very big number by historic standards, but narrowing quite sharply. I'm in doubt, really, whether that, at this point, can still support many of the aggressive tax-cutting agendas that so many of the candidates are proposing. More immediately worrying is the current account, the worst quarter almost since records began at minus 8.3%. Exports to the Eurozone and to the EU down particularly, so a more competitive backdrop for British exports really critical for the new leader. Turning to the labour markets on the second slide, you can see the surge in inflation squeezing real wages. There's the UK CPI rising by 9.1%, with average earnings just rising by still a strong but much less in real terms, 4.2%. The difference is minus 4.8%, one of the biggest squeezes on real incomes that we've seen in a generation. Allied to this, of course, labour markets are very tight still. The unemployment rate sits at 3.8%. And the employment rate, that's what percentage of the working population are fully employed, has still not recovered to its pre-pandemic levels. This, of course, is a recipe for industrial action and strife across labour markets in general. So I think working to get down that inflation rate to bring workers' wages back into real territory, an essential priority for the new administration. Thirdly, low-income groups. There's a really worrying reading from the UK consumer confidence numbers. I've shown there at minus 41, one of the lowest readings since the index began back in the early 70s, showing the real squeeze that rising pump prices on the right-hand side and rising food prices are putting on to working families. So I think support still desperately needed for lower income groups, and I think that would be a really credible use of any financial flexibility that we do have. Fourthly, trade. And I've shown here in these bubbles the volume of UK trade with various trading partners. You can see the largest at 46% of our total trade with the EU, then in yellow the US, then a number of dots at a 10%, 1% or even smaller level of total British trade. I draw attention first to those two purple blocks, the small dots on the right there, Australia and New Zealand. While we signed deep and successful trade deals with them, they only cover 1.4% of UK trade. So it's desperately important that we establish lower friction, better trading relations with the EU in green and the US in yellow. They are central to our foreign trade ambitions. And I think that will be a real issue for the new Prime Minister, and whether with the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is room to negotiate on those. Fifthly, in a very good paper from the Office of Budget Responsibility, they remind us of the impact of defence. Given the current conditions in Ukraine and the long-term strategic challenges from both Russia and China, it's likely the UK defence spending is going to rise. Historically, and they've done this chart right back to 1700, armed conflicts have been the most important drivers of fiscal outcomes in the UK. In other words, they cost the most. And when that spending has happened, it potentially only declines slowly. In all major conflicts, we borrowed in excess of 10% of GDP per annum and added 70% of debt to GDP to our overall stock. So that is a real challenge, how to fund defence and at what rate to allow that budget to grow as the levels of conflict rises. So let's look at the last slide, which compares the UK with other sovereign nations and gives some idea of the aspirations that a new Prime Minister might have. I've compared us together against 6 what I would class as successful sovereign countries: Canada, Norway, Switzerland, South Korea, Japan and Singapore. And I've looked at their key economic indicators. On average, they all run a current account surplus. Britain runs a very large deficit. We're going to have to work on those trade accounts. Secondly, their budgets are almost in balance, despite the stresses of COVID, compared to our near 6% deficit. We're going to have to work on those deficit numbers. Thirdly, consumer prices. They tend to have inflation, yes, but lower than the global average, and compared in average around 5%, compared to our figure of 9.1. We're going to have to work particularly on sterling and other levers of control to try and bring those inflation numbers down. Finally, they're concerned about their credit rating. They're on their own after all, they're not members of big blocs. And you'll see that a lot of them have AAA ratings. Britain at the moment at AA-. It would be excellent to see that rating improve over time. So I hope that's been useful and gives you some idea of the priorities that we face economically and geopolitically in the UK and what our economy looks like in comparison to other successful independent nations. Thank you.